Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. In the autumn of 1974, the name MacGoffin would become synonymous with one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries to emerge from the isolated hollows of Appalachian, Kentucky. What began as a traditional family gathering during Thanksgiving weekend would evolve into a case that continues to perplex investigators and haunt the collective memory of those who lived through the events that unfolded in the shadow of Pine Mountain. The story centers on three adult sisters who had returned to their ancestral family home for what should have been a routine holiday celebration. Margaret MacGoffin, 38 years old at the time, was the eldest of the siblings. She had moved to Louisville 15 years prior and worked as a secretary for a coal mining company. Her sister Ruth, 35, had remained closer to home, living in Hazard, where she managed a small boarding house for miners and their families. The youngest sister, Helen, was 32 and had spent the previous decade in Cincinnati working various jobs and maintaining minimal contact with her family until that fateful autumn. The family property sat approximately 12 miles southeast of Salyersville, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest and across two creek beds. The house itself was a two-story frame structure built in 1896 by their grandfather, Elijah MacGoffin, on land that had been in the family since before the Civil War. Local records indicate the property encompassed nearly 200 acres of heavily wooded mountainside, with the nearest neighbor living more than 3 miles away through difficult terrain. According to county records archived in the MacGoffin County Courthouse, the sisters had inherited the property jointly following the death of their father, Thomas MacGoffin, in January of 1973. Their mother, Sarah, had passed away during the harsh winter of 1968, leaving Thomas to live alone in the increasingly deteriorating house until his own death from what the local physician recorded as heart failure. The house had sat empty for nearly 2 years when the sisters decided to gather there for Thanksgiving. Neighbors would later tell investigators that they had occasionally seen smoke rising from the chimney during the months leading up to that November, suggesting that one or more of the sisters had been visiting the property and attempting to make it habitable again. What drew the three women back to a place they had all been eager to leave remains unclear. Letters found much later in Margaret's personal effects, discovered after her own death in 1967, suggested that there had been ongoing discussions about selling the property. However, these same letters hint at some form of disagreement between the sisters regarding the house's future, with references to things that need to be settled and questions that father never answered. The last confirmed sighting of all three sisters together occurred on Thursday, November 21st, 1974, when they stopped at Combs General Store in Salyersville to purchase supplies. The store owner, Earl Combs, would later describe their demeanor as subdued but not unusual for the MacGoffin family, whom he remembered as always being quiet folk who kept to themselves. The purchases included basic food items, kerosene for lamps, and several batteries for flashlights, suggesting they were preparing for an extended stay at the house without electricity. Earl Combs noted that Ruth had asked specifically about the weather forecast, expressing concern about potential snow that might make the road to the house impassable. The local weather station had indeed predicted the possibility of early snow for the weekend, though temperatures remained above freezing through the holiday. What happened after the sisters returned to the house that Thursday afternoon would remain largely unknown until a series of discoveries began to emerge years later. The first indication that something was amiss came on the following Tuesday, November 26th, when Margaret failed to return to her job in Louisville. Her supervisor, Robert Hayes, became concerned after she missed 2 consecutive days without contact, which was entirely out of character for someone he described as the most reliable employee we had. Hayes contacted the Magoffin County Sheriff's Office on Wednesday, November 27th, but initial attempts to reach the house were unsuccessful due to the remote location and lack of telephone service. Deputy Sheriff James Crawford made the first official visit to the property on Thursday, November 28th, exactly 1 week after the sisters had been seen in town. Crawford's initial report, filed that same day, described finding the house apparently empty, but with signs of recent habitation. The front door was unlocked, and there were dishes in the kitchen sink that appeared to have been used for a meal. A fire had been laid in the main fireplace, but was cold, suggesting it had been several days since anyone had tended to it. Most notably, Crawford reported finding 3 beds that appeared to have been slept in, with personal belongings scattered throughout the house, indicating that all 3 sisters had indeed been staying there. What troubled Crawford most was the apparent normalcy of the scene. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of hasty departure, and no obvious explanation for why 3 adult women would simply abandon the house simultaneously, leaving behind personal items including Margaret's purse with her identification and money intact. The sheriff's office conducted a more thorough search of the property over the following days, but the investigation was hampered by early snowfall that made the terrain treacherous and potentially obscured any tracks or evidence that might have existed. Search teams focused on the immediate area around the house and the most obvious paths through the surrounding forest, but the vast expanse of wilderness made a comprehensive search impossible with the resources available. Local newspapers covered the disappearance sparingly, with the Salyersville Herald running a brief item requesting information about the missing women. However, the remote nature of the case and the family's history of privacy meant that public attention remained limited. Most residents of the area simply assumed that the sisters had decided to leave the mountains permanently, perhaps selling the property to developers who had been showing increased interest in coal rights throughout the region. The case might have remained nothing more than an unexplained disappearance if not for a series of discoveries that began to emerge in the summer of 1975. A local man named Curtis Fleming, who supplemented his income by hunting ginseng in the deep woods, reported finding what appeared to be a makeshift camp approximately 2 miles northeast of the Magoffin house. The site contained the remnants of a small fire ring, some scattered clothing that appeared to be women's garments, and most disturbing, what Fleming described as scratched marks on several trees that looked as though they had been made by human fingernails. Fleming's report prompted Sheriff Crawford to conduct another search of the area, this time with additional personnel and better weather conditions. What they found was a scene that raised more questions than it answered. The clothing was indeed women's garments, and they appeared to match descriptions of items the sisters had been known to own. However, the garments were arranged in what seemed to be an almost ritualistic pattern around the cold fire ring, and they showed signs of having been cut rather than torn or naturally damaged. More disturbing was the discovery of a series of shallow depressions in the earth around the campsite, each roughly the size and shape of a human body. The depressions appeared to have been deliberately dug and then filled back in, though excavation revealed nothing but disturbed soil and decomposed organic matter that could not be definitively identified. Perhaps most unsettling was the condition of the trees surrounding the site. Multiple large oak and maple trees bore deep scratches in their bark, starting at approximately shoulder height for an average adult and extending downward. The pattern of the scratches suggested they had been made by someone in extreme distress, clawing at the bark with desperate intensity. Some of the scratches were deep enough to have drawn sap from the trees, and the aged appearance of the markings suggested they had been made months earlier, possibly around the time of the sisters' disappearance. Dr. Martin Hensley, a forensic specialist brought in from the University of Kentucky, examined the site and the evidence collected there. His report, filed in September of 1975, concluded that the scene showed signs of human activity but could not definitively connect it to the missing sisters. The clothing fragments were too deteriorated for positive identification, and while the scratches on the trees were consistent with human-made marks, they could not be dated precisely enough to establish a timeline. What concerned Dr. Hensley most was the apparent deliberate nature of the scene's arrangement. In his professional opinion, the positioning of the clothing and the geometric pattern of the filled depressions suggested that the site had been created intentionally, possibly as some form of memorial or marker. However, he could not determine whether this arrangement had been made by the missing women themselves or by some unknown party after their disappearance. The investigation took an even more disturbing turn in October of 1975, when a second site was discovered by a survey crew working for a mining company that was evaluating the area for potential operations. This location, approximately 4 miles southwest of the original house, contained evidence that was both more extensive and more troubling than the first discovery. The survey team, led by engineer Robert Caldwell, initially noticed the site because of an unusual odor that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Upon closer investigation, they found a circular clearing in the forest where no trees grew, despite the fact that the surrounding area was heavily forested. The soil in this clearing was dark and rich, suggesting high organic content, but attempts to determine the source of this enrichment proved inconclusive. More significant was the discovery of a series of carved symbols in the trunks of trees that formed a rough circle around the clearing. The symbols were crude but appeared to have been made with deliberate intent, consisting mainly of straight lines and simple geometric shapes. Dr. Hensley was again called in to examine these markings, but he was unable to connect them to any known symbolic system or cultural tradition from the region. What made the symbols particularly unsettling was their apparent freshness relative to the other evidence found at the site. While the cleared area showed signs of being several months old, the tree carvings appeared to have been made more recently, possibly within weeks of their discovery. This suggested that someone had been returning to the site regularly, adding new markings over time. Local folklore began to accumulate around the discoveries, with some residents claiming that the McGoffin family had always been different, and that strange things had happened on their property for generations. These stories, while lacking documentary support, painted a picture of a family that had remained isolated not just by choice, but because of some underlying darkness that the community preferred not to acknowledge directly. One elderly resident, Mary Beth Combs, who had known the McGoffin family since her youth, provided investigators with the most detailed account of the family's history. According to her testimony, given in November of 1975, the McGoffin women had always been regarded with a mixture of respect and unease by their neighbors. She described them as intelligent and capable, but possessing an intensity that made others uncomfortable. Mary Beth recalled that the sisters' mother, Sarah, had been known for her extensive knowledge of traditional mountain remedies and was often consulted by neighbors dealing with various ailments. However, she also mentioned that Sarah had been increasingly reclusive in the years before her death, rarely leaving the family property and discouraging visits from neighbors. When Sarah died during the winter of 1968, she had been found in her kitchen by her husband Thomas, but the circumstances of her death had raised questions that were never fully resolved. According to Mary Beth's account, Sarah had been discovered sitting at the kitchen table, dressed in her finest clothes despite the early hour and the fact that no special occasion was known to be taking place. The local physician who examined her found no obvious cause of death, attributing her passing to heart failure brought on by the stresses of mountain living and advancing age. However, family members who prepared her body for burial noted that her hands and arms bore numerous small scratches and marks, as though she had been struggling with something immediately before her death. More troubling was the condition of the kitchen where she was found. Despite the family's reputation for maintaining an orderly household, the room showed signs of significant disturbance. Chairs had been overturned, dishes were broken on the floor, and the table where Sarah was discovered bore deep scratch marks in its wooden surface. Thomas Magoffin had explained these conditions by claiming that his wife had been experiencing confusion and disorientation in the weeks before her death, but neighbors noted that he seemed unusually eager to have the house cleaned and restored to order before the funeral. The investigation into Sarah's death had been minimal, reflecting both the limited resources of the county coroner's office and the family's desire for privacy during their time of grief. However, Mary Beth mentioned that she had attended the funeral and noticed that the three daughters seemed more angry than sad, directing harsh looks toward their father throughout the service. She had attributed this to grief manifesting in different ways, but in retrospect, she wondered if there had been underlying family tensions that outsiders had not been aware of. Thomas Magoffin's own death in January of 1973 had been similarly puzzling, though it had attracted even less official attention. He had been found in the barn behind the house by a neighbor who had become concerned after not seeing any signs of activity at the property for several days. The neighbor, Walter Sloan, had gone to check on Thomas after noticing that the family's livestock had not been fed and were making distressed sounds that could be heard from considerable distance. Walter found Thomas lying on the barn floor beneath the hayloft, apparently having fallen from the upper level where he had been working. The local physician ruled his death accidental, concluding that he had lost his footing while moving hay bales and suffered fatal injuries in the fall. However, Walter later told investigators that the scene had struck him as odd for several reasons. First, Thomas had been found wearing clothes that were far too formal for barn work, including leather shoes that would have provided poor footing on the wooden planks of the loft. Second, the ladder leading to the upper level had been positioned at an unusual angle, making it difficult to climb safely. Most significantly, Walter had noticed that Thomas appeared to have been arranging the hay bales in a specific pattern rather than simply storing them, though he could not determine what that pattern was meant to represent. Walter also mentioned that he had found several personal items scattered around the barn that seemed out of place, including what appeared to be old family photographs and some papers that looked like letters or documents. When he mentioned these items to the daughters at the funeral, they claimed to have no knowledge of them and insisted that their father had become increasingly disorganized in his final months. However, Walter noticed that they seemed very interested in recovering these materials and spent considerable time searching the barn after the burial. The discovery of these family history details prompted investigators to take a closer look at the house itself, which had remained largely untouched since the initial search for the missing sisters. A more thorough examination of the property in the spring of 1976 revealed several disturbing elements that had been overlooked during the original investigation. In the basement of the house, which had been dismissed as simply a root cellar during the first search, investigators found evidence of modifications that appeared to have been made sometime in the months before the sisters' disappearance. The basement had been partially excavated, creating a space significantly larger than would have been necessary for simple food storage. The walls showed signs of recent work with stones that appeared to have been moved and repositioned, and there were marks in the floor suggesting that heavy objects had been dragged across it. Most unsettling was the discovery of what appeared to be restraint hardware embedded in the stone walls. Iron rings had been anchored into the masonry at various heights, and the stone around them showed signs of having been stressed by significant force. The metal itself was heavily rusted, making it difficult to determine when it had been installed, but the surrounding stonework suggested the modifications were relatively recent. Dr. Hensley was again called in to examine these findings, and his report raised the possibility that the basement had been modified for purposes that went far beyond normal household use. While he stopped short of speculating about the specific nature of these modifications, he noted that the arrangement of the restraint points and the size of the space were consistent with confinement rather than storage. Additional evidence found in the basement included scratched marks in the stone walls, similar to those discovered at the forest campsites, suggesting that someone had spent considerable time in the space under conditions of extreme distress. Chemical analysis of stains found on the floor revealed traces of human bodily fluids, though decomposition made it impossible to determine their age or the specific circumstances under which they had been deposited. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a collection of personal items hidden beneath a loose stone in the basement floor. The cache included jewelry that neighbors identified as having belonged to Sarah McGoffin, photographs of the family dating back several generations, and a series of handwritten documents that appeared to be some form of record-keeping or diary. The documents, written in several different hands and spanning what appeared to be many years, contained fragmentary entries that seemed to describe various events and observations related to the family's activities. Much of the writing was difficult to decipher due to poor handwriting and the deteriorated condition of the paper, but certain phrases stood out as particularly troubling. One entry, apparently written by Sarah McGoffin, based on handwriting comparison with known samples, described the necessity of maintaining silence and referenced methods that grandmother taught me for keeping order in the house. Another passage in what appeared to be Thomas's handwriting mentioned preparations that must be made and ensuring that the traditions continue even when we are gone. Most disturbing were entries that appeared to have been written by the daughters themselves, possibly during their youth. These fragmentary passages included references to lessons learned in the basement and understanding what happens to those who speak of family matters to outsiders. The tone of these entries suggested fear rather than willing participation in whatever family traditions were being referenced. Dr. Hensley's analysis of the handwriting samples and paper aging suggested that the documents represented a record-keeping system that had been maintained over multiple generations, with different family members adding entries over time. The most recent entries appeared to date from the early 1970s, around the time of Thomas's death, and seemed to focus on plans for completing the work that has been started and ensuring that the family obligations are met. The discovery of these documents prompted a re-examination of local historical records related to the McGoffin family property. Research conducted by graduate students from the University of Kentucky revealed a pattern of unusual events associated with the land dating back to the late 1800s. County records from the 1890s contained several reports of missing persons cases that seemed to center around the area where the McGoffin property was located. These cases involved individuals who had been traveling through the region and were known to have been in the vicinity of the mountain before disappearing without trace. While such disappearances were not uncommon in the rugged terrain of eastern Kentucky, the frequency of cases associated with this particular area was statistically significant. More recent records from the early 20th century included several reports filed with the county sheriff's office regarding strange sounds and unexplained phenomena observed by people traveling past the McGoffin property. These reports, while often dismissed as mountain folklore, described sounds of distress coming from the direction of the house, unusual lights visible at night, and the discovery of disturbed earth in areas adjacent to the property. One particularly detailed report from 1923 described an incident involving a traveling salesman who claimed to have sought shelter at the McGoffin house during a severe thunderstorm. According to his account, filed with the sheriff's office several days after the incident, He had been welcomed into the house by the family, but had been disturbed by sounds coming from what he assumed was the basement. When he asked about the sounds, which he described as like someone trying to speak but unable to make words, the family had become hostile and ordered him to leave immediately despite the dangerous weather conditions. The salesman reported that as he left the property, he had seen lights in the basement windows and had heard what sounded like multiple voices engaged in some form of chanting or repetitive speaking. He also claimed to have noticed freshly disturbed earth near the house as though graves had been recently dug, but admitted that the darkness and poor weather conditions made it difficult to be certain of what he had observed. While such accounts might normally be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding, the pattern of similar reports over several decades suggested that there might have been ongoing unusual activities at the property that the family had been careful to conceal from outsiders. The investigation reached a turning point in the autumn of 1976 when a local historian named Professor Elizabeth Morrison began researching the genealogy of mountain families for a book she was writing about Appalachian culture. Professor Morrison's research into the McGoffin family lineage revealed connections that had not been apparent to previous investigators. Through examination of church records, census data, and family documents held in various archives, Professor Morrison discovered that the McGoffin family had been involved in several documented cases of unusual behavior dating back to the early settlement period in Kentucky. More significantly, her research revealed that many of the missing person cases from previous decades involved individuals who had been investigating or asking questions about the family's activities. Professor Morrison's most troubling discovery concerned a pattern of inheritance within the McGoffin family that seemed to follow unusual rules. Traditional mountain families typically passed property down through male lineage, but the McGoffin property had consistently been inherited by female family members, often under circumstances that involved the suspicious deaths or disappearances of male heirs who might have had stronger legal claims to the land. Court records from the late 1800s showed that Elijah McGoffin, who had built the house, had intended to leave the property to his eldest son. However, that son had disappeared under mysterious circumstances just months before Elijah's death, leading to the property passing to Elijah's daughter, who became Sarah McGoffin's grandmother. Similar patterns appeared in subsequent generations, with male heirs consistently failing to survive to inherit the property. Professor Morrison's research also uncovered evidence that the McGoffin women had maintained connections with other families throughout the region, who seemed to share similar traditions of secrecy and unusual inheritance patterns. These connections suggested that what had happened to the three sisters might be part of a broader network of activities that extended beyond a single family or property. Most significantly, Professor Morrison discovered that several other properties in the region had been associated with unexplained disappearances and strange phenomena, and that these properties had all been owned by families with documented connections to the McGoffins through marriage, business relationships, or shared ancestry. The implications of these findings prompted a broader investigation that extended beyond the original missing persons case. State investigators began examining multiple properties throughout eastern Kentucky, looking for patterns similar to what had been discovered at the McGoffin house. What they found was a network of isolated properties, often owned by families with long histories in the region, that showed signs of unusual activities dating back multiple generations. Many of these properties contained modified basements or outbuildings that appeared to have been designed for confinement, and several contained evidence of disturbed earth suggesting numerous burials over time. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that these families had maintained detailed records of their activities, hidden in various locations on their properties. These documents, written in multiple hands over many decades, described what appeared to be a systematic program of capturing, confining, and ultimately eliminating individuals who posed perceived threats to the family's privacy and traditions. The records suggested that the families operated according to a shared belief system that viewed outsiders as inherently dangerous and that required the elimination of anyone who might expose their activities to authorities or the broader community. The system appeared to have been passed down through female lineage, with daughters being trained from a young age to continue the traditions their mothers and grandmothers had maintained. Most chilling was the discovery that the families had maintained detailed records of their victims, including names, dates of capture, and methods of elimination. These records suggested that the activities had been ongoing for nearly a century, with dozens of victims taken over the years. Many of the names in these records corresponded to historical missing person cases that had never been solved. The investigation into Margaret, Ruth, and Helen McGoffin's disappearance took on new significance when investigators realized that the sisters might not have been victims of the family traditions, but rather participants who had been attempting to continue them. Evidence found at the house and the forest campsites suggested that the sisters had been preparing for some form of continuation of their family's activities when something had gone wrong. Analysis of the timeline suggested that the sisters had returned to the family property not for a simple holiday gathering, but to conduct some form of ritual or ceremony related to their family's traditions. The evidence found in the basement indicated that they had been preparing the space for use, and the supplies they had purchased suggested they were planning for an extended period of activity. The discovery of the forest campsites took on new meaning when investigators realized that these locations might have been intended as temporary holding areas for potential victims who were to be brought back to the house for the final stages of whatever process the family had been conducting. The arranged clothing and deliberate positioning of objects suggested that the sites had been prepared according to specific instructions or traditions passed down through the family. The scratched trees and disturbed earth indicated that someone had indeed been held at these locations under conditions of extreme distress, but the identity of those individuals remained unknown. The fact that the sites showed signs of repeated use over several months suggested that the sisters had been active in their family's traditions for some time before their own disappearance. The question of what had ultimately happened to Margaret, Ruth, and Helen remained unanswered, even as the scope of the investigation broadened. The evidence suggested that they had been victims of their own family system, possibly as a result of internal conflicts or failures to follow established protocols. The violent nature of the evidence found at the campsites indicated that whatever had happened to them had been far from peaceful. One theory that emerged from the investigation was that the sisters had been involved in a power struggle over control of the family's activities and property. The documents found in the basement suggested that there had been disagreements about how to proceed with the family traditions, particularly given the increasing attention from outside authorities and the changing social conditions in the region that made their activities more difficult to conceal. Another possibility was that the sisters had been betrayed by other members of the network of families they had been connected to. Evidence found at some of the other properties suggested that there had been conflicts between different families over territory and methods, and that these conflicts had sometimes resulted in violent confrontations between former allies. The investigation ultimately concluded that Margaret, Ruth, and Helen McGoffin had met violent ends sometime during the Thanksgiving weekend of 1974. But the specific circumstances of their deaths and the location of their remains were never definitively established. The evidence suggested that they had been killed by individuals familiar with their family's methods and traditions, possibly as part of an ongoing conflict within the network of families that had maintained these activities for generations. The broader investigation into the network of properties and families associated with similar activities continued through 1977, ultimately resulting in the identification of more than 40 properties where evidence of criminal activity was found. However, by the time investigators had pieced together the scope of the network, most of the individuals responsible for maintaining it had either died or disappeared, making prosecution impossible in many cases. The few surviving members of the families involved claimed to have no knowledge of the activities that had been documented at their properties, insisting that they had been conducted by previous generations and had ended years earlier. Without living witnesses or more concrete evidence, authorities were unable to pursue criminal charges in most cases. The McGoffin property was eventually sold by the county for unpaid taxes in 1978. The new owners, a development company interested in mineral rights, demolished the house and most of the outbuildings after conducting their own examination of the property. Workers involved in the demolition reported finding additional evidence of disturbed earth throughout the property. But by then the official investigation had been closed and no systematic excavation was conducted. Local residents continue to avoid the area where the McGoffin house once stood. Hunters and hikers who venture into the surrounding forest occasionally report finding evidence of the campsites that had been discovered during the investigation, though most of the original markers have been obscured by natural growth over the years. The case of the McGoffin sisters remains officially unsolved, though investigators believe they understand the general circumstances that led to their disappearance. The broader investigation that their case prompted revealed a dark chapter in the history of isolated Appalachian communities, demonstrating how geography and culture could combine to conceal systematic criminal activity over multiple generations. Professor Morrison completed her book about Appalachian family traditions in 1979, though she was required to remove most of the material related to the McGoffin case and similar families due to ongoing legal concerns. Her published work focused on more benign cultural practices, but she maintained private research files that documented the full scope of what she had discovered. In 1982, Professor Morrison was found dead in her office at the university under circumstances that were ruled accidental, but raised questions among those familiar with her research. She had apparently fallen down a stairway in the academic building where she worked, suffering fatal injuries. However, colleagues noted that her research files related to the Appalachian family networks had been disturbed and several key documents were missing. The official investigation into Professor Morrison's death concluded that she had simply lost her footing on stairs that were known to be poorly lit and potentially hazardous. However, some individuals familiar with her work suspected that her death might have been connected to her research into the mountain families and the secrets they had worked so hard to protect. The records of the investigation into the McGoffin case and the broader network of families were archived by state authorities in 1978 and remain sealed from public access. Occasional requests for information about the case are denied on the grounds that the investigation involved sensitive information related to ongoing criminal matters, though no prosecutions have been pursued in connection with the case for more than 4 decades. The legacy of the McGoffin sisters and the dark traditions they represented continues to influence the culture of eastern Kentucky in subtle ways. Families with long histories in the region remain notably private about their ancestry and family traditions, and there is an unspoken understanding that certain topics are not appropriate for discussion with outsiders. Modern development in the area has been limited, partly due to the challenging terrain but also because of persistent rumors about the history of certain properties. Mining and logging operations occasionally encounter evidence of old burial sites or modified structures that suggest the activities documented in the McGoffin case may have been more widespread than was ever officially acknowledged. The few journalists and researchers who have attempted to investigate the case in recent years have encountered significant resistance from local residents and officials. Most requests for information are met with denials that any such case ever existed, despite the documented evidence contained in archived police reports and court records. The house where the McGoffin sisters spent their final days no longer stands, and the property has been allowed to return to forest. However, the foundations of the original structure remain visible to those who know where to look, and the modified basement can still be accessed by individuals determined enough to clear away the debris and vegetation that have accumulated over the decades. The forest campsites discovered during the investigation have been reclaimed by nature, but experienced woodsmen can still identify locations where the earth was disturbed and trees were marked. These sites serve as silent reminders of activities that most residents of the region prefer to forget, evidence of a time when isolation and tradition combined to enable unspeakable acts. The broader implications of the McGoffin case extend beyond the specific circumstances of 3 missing sisters. The investigation revealed how geographic isolation, cultural traditions, and systematic secrecy could combine to enable criminal activity on a scale that challenged conventional understanding of rural crime patterns. The case also demonstrated the limitations of law enforcement resources when confronting organized criminal activity that had been operating for multiple generations across a wide geographic area. The network of families that had maintained these traditions had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and eliminating threats to their activities, making them extremely difficult to investigate using conventional police methods. Perhaps most disturbing was the revelation that the activities documented in the McGoffin case had been enabled by a broader community culture that prioritized privacy and non-interference over public safety. The persistent reluctance of local residents to discuss the case or provide information to investigators suggested that knowledge of these activities had been more widespread than was ever officially acknowledged. The psychological impact of the case on those who were directly involved in the investigation has been documented in several academic studies of law enforcement trauma. Many of the officers and specialists who worked on the case reported experiencing lasting effects from their exposure to the evidence and crime scenes associated with the family network's activities. Dr. Hensley, who had served as the primary forensic consultant throughout the investigation, retired from his position at the University of Kentucky in 1979 and refused to discuss the case in any professional context thereafter. Colleagues reported that he had become increasingly withdrawn and had expressed concerns about his own safety related to his involvement in the investigation. The case has been referenced in several academic studies of organized crime in rural settings, though these references typically focus on methodological aspects rather than the specific details of the crimes that were documented. The reluctance of scholars to engage with the case directly reflects both the sensitivity of the material and ongoing concerns about the safety of individuals who might draw attention to themselves by studying these events too closely. Law enforcement training programs have incorporated lessons learned from the McGoffin case into their curricula for dealing with complex criminal networks in isolated communities. However, these training materials focus on procedural and investigative techniques rather than the specific circumstances that enabled the criminal activities to persist for so many decades. The case continues to influence police procedures for missing person investigations in rural areas, particularly those involving multiple victims or evidence of systematic criminal activity. The recognition that missing person cases might be connected to broader criminal networks rather than isolated incidents has led to improved coordination between different law enforcement agencies and more systematic approaches to investigating patterns of disappearances. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to some of the evidence collected during the original investigation, yielding additional insights into the scope and methods of the criminal activities that were documented. However, these findings have not been made public, and it is unclear whether they have led to any new investigative efforts. The geographic area where the McGoffin case unfolded remains sparsely populated, and economic development has been limited by both natural challenges and persistent concerns about the history of the region. Tourism and recreational activities that might bring outsiders into the area have been discouraged by local authorities, officially due to safety concerns related to the terrain, but possibly also due to concerns about what visitors might discover. The cultural impact of the case on the broader Appalachian community has been significant but largely unacknowledged. The revelation that systematic criminal activity had been maintained for generations by respected local families challenged assumptions about the nature of mountain communities and the relationship between isolation and criminality. Academic research into Appalachian culture and history has been influenced by the case, though this influence is rarely acknowledged directly. Scholars working in the region have become more sensitive to the potential for discovering evidence of activities that local communities prefer to keep hidden, and research methodologies have been modified to account for the possibility of encountering information that might be dangerous to pursue. The legal implications of the case continue to influence how authorities approach investigations involving multiple jurisdictions and potential criminal networks operating across state or regional boundaries. The recognition that traditional approaches to rural crime investigation might be inadequate for complex cases has led to the development of new protocols for multi-agency cooperation and resource sharing. The case has also influenced how mental health professionals understand the psychological impact of extreme isolation and systematic family trauma. The evidence that criminal activities had been passed down through generations raised questions about how such traditions could be maintained and what psychological mechanisms enabled individuals to participate in activities that violated fundamental social norms. Treatment approaches for individuals who have escaped from isolated communities where criminal activities were normalized have been developed based partly on insights gained from the McGoffin case and similar investigations. These approaches recognize that traditional therapeutic methods might be inadequate for addressing trauma that has been systematically perpetuated across multiple generations. The case remains a subject of fascination for researchers and law enforcement professionals, though direct investigation is discouraged due to ongoing safety concerns and the sensitive nature of the evidence that was collected. The recognition that similar criminal networks might still be operating in isolated communities throughout Appalachia and other rural regions has led to increased vigilance, but also to greater caution about pursuing investigations that might encounter organized resistance. The files related to the McGoffin case are scheduled to be reviewed for possible declassification in 1999, though it is unclear whether any significant new information will be made available to the public at that time. The decision about what information to release will depend partly on assessments of whether the criminal networks documented in the case are still active and whether public disclosure might interfere with ongoing law enforcement activities. Meanwhile, the memory of Margaret, Ruth, and Helen McGoffin serves as a reminder that even in the most isolated and seemingly peaceful rural communities, darkness can persist across generations, hidden behind traditions of privacy and protected by the silence of those who know but choose not to speak. Their story challenges comfortable assumptions about the nature of evil and the relationship between family, community, and individual moral responsibility. The remote mountains of eastern Kentucky continue to guard their secrets, and the wind that moves through the trees where the McGoffin house once stood carries echoes of voices that will never be heard again. In the end, the case represents not just the disappearance of 3 individuals, but the revelation of a hidden world that operated according to rules that civilized society could barely comprehend, much less accept. The legacy of that Thanksgiving weekend in 1974 extends far beyond the fate of 3 sisters who returned home for what should have been a simple family gathering. It serves as evidence that the capacity for systematic evil can flourish in unexpected places, protected by isolation and perpetuated by traditions that transform victims into perpetrators across the generations. And somewhere in the archives of law enforcement agencies and academic institutions, the full truth of what happened in those remote mountains continues to wait. Documented but sealed away, a testament to the darkness that can exist in the spaces between civilization's reach and the places where human nature reveals its most troubling possibilities.